Hey everyone, it's Ornlu with something a little bit different for today. As many of you know, the launch of Age of Empires 4 is just around the corner, and this past weekend was the first public stress test where everybody had a chance to get their hands on the game. I myself streamed a bunch of 1v1 multiplayer games, and several of those can be found on my YouTube channel. Unfortunately, the general first impressions for AoE4 were mixed at best. Of course, there were plenty of people who enjoyed the game, myself included, but still many others found various aspects of AoE4 to either be frustrating or just underwhelming. For my part, I actually had the chance to be part of the Cardinal Council, where members of the various Age communities could test the game and give feedback. So I've been able to see how this game has developed since around the end of 2018. To be totally candid, I have a ton of very core issues with AoE4, but many of those are just my personal preferences. I don't want this video to be seen as me just trashing AoE4, but rather a constructive platform to discuss the most important changes that need to be made to make Age of Empires 4 a successful game, especially when it comes to fostering a competitive multiplayer community, because I think that's what most of us want. Again, these are all just my opinions, but every entry on this list is a change that I have seen many people ask for across various forums, discords, and Twitch chats. So with that, let's get into my top 5 most important changes that Relic needs to make for Age of Empires 4. Starting of course with number 5, customizable hotkeys. Okay, so this one may be a non-issue for many players, but for anyone who is used to the classic RTS hotkeys, AoE4 is pretty frustrating. Essentially, you have a grid system where a single set of hotkeys are used for every unit and building based on its position on the UI grid. For example, by default, the hotkey for the top leftmost unit, building, or technology in the game is Q. The one to its immediate right is W, and so on. This is kind of similar to the newer hotkey layouts for the definitive editions of AoE 1, 2, and 3, but unlike those games, there is no way to get a classic hotkey system. To clarify, what I mean by classic hotkey layout is the system historically used by most RTS games, Age of Empires included. Here, you have each and every technology, unit, and building bound to their own unique hotkey, regardless of where that thing is placed in the user interface. You can make arguments either way when it comes to which system is more efficient than the other, but that's beside the point. The fact is that myself and tons of other players out there are just used to the old hotkey system and want to have the option to have that in AoE4 as well. It's just kind of a no-brainer. Here, you could also lump in other quality of life features like small trees, global queue, and so on, but for me, the hotkey issue is the one that stands out the most. Next is number 4, visual clarity. Now, this is not a condemnation of the overall art style of AoE4. Personally, I think that it kind of looks cartoony, mobile gamey, but again, that's just a matter of personal preference. Where I do have serious issues are how just freaking hard it is to tell stuff apart. The colors are almost too bright, and it's just very difficult to differentiate between units. This alone actually makes micromanaging fights quite difficult, as a spearman looks very similar to a man-at-arms, a camel archer looks very similar to a camel rider, etc. On top of that, it's almost like the units blend into the map itself in most cases. I'm not saying that Age of Empires 4 looks like a Monet painting, but it's one of those things that it just feels like it should be better. One of the ways this could be done is to make the units themselves look more different from one another, beyond just player color. In Age of Empires 2, this is done in a myriad of ways. For example, did you ever notice that the Scout line ride tan-colored horses, the Knight line rides white horses, and Cav Archers ride brown horses? This was done very intentionally, so that the player could more easily distinguish between the different types of units. Similarly, if you look at the Militia line, every single unit within it, again, looks very different from one another. Militia are clearly wearing leather armor and wield maces, men-at-arms have short swords and a big kite shield, longswordsmen have a, well, longsword but drop the shield, two-handed swordsmen have an even longer sword as well as gold trimming on their armor, and then finally you have the champion which has white trimming on its armor and is also a lot more ornate. I'm not saying that AoE2 is perfect in this regard, yeah, I'm looking at you Cav Archers versus heavy Cav Archers, but it's still something that AoE4 could and should learn from. Next is number 3, UI Overhaul. Okay, now that we're getting into my top 3 most needed changes, we are really starting to see some major red flags when it comes to the multiplayer experience. For those who don't know, UI stands for User Interface, which for our purposes here just means all of the stuff that you see in-game that isn't the game itself. Under this umbrella, we have the minimap, unit stats, building commands, technology research icons, etc. I get that Relic was going for the whole minimalistic artwork kind of deal with AoE4, but to be blunt, all of this stuff needs to be completely redone. Starting with the minimap, it's way too hard to tell what is going on due to the gigantic resource icons that are scattered everywhere, and even then, it's kinda hard to tell the resource icons apart, especially when there are a bunch that are close together. When it comes to the unit/building stats tab, I have no idea what's going on with the whole star-based system thing. It just seems really distracting and obscures the core stats that a player wants and needs to see. I will say that I like how you can look more closely at the unit attack bonuses and attack speed and whatnot, but the basic display is just way too busy in my view. Relatedly, they really need to get just clearer icon artwork for all of the units, buildings, and technologies in the game. They all share the same basic color scheme of yellow on black, and it just makes it so unnecessarily difficult to identify the upgrades. I would just do what AoE2, and then to a lesser extent AOM and AoE3, did with having just unique little bits of artwork for all of the icons in the game. It really goes a long way in helping them stand out. Lastly, I've got to mention the crazy laser show that's going on in a game of AoE4. Seriously, it's like a 90s rave in there. You've got bright lasers for the gather points, unit commands, the borders of the map, and so on. Couple that with the glowy lights around buildings for most civilizations when it comes to developing your base, like with the Abbasid Golden Age bonus, the English Farm bonus, and so on. Somehow it feels like there's too much and too little at the same time when it comes to the AoE4 UI, and that just needs to be refined a lot. Now for number 2, unit responsiveness. So up to this point, the changes that I've talked about have all been about visuals and user accessibility, but now we come to some very core gameplay issues. Simply put, units in AoE4 all feel incredibly clunky. There is clearly some input delay on pretty much every command in the game, and even if it's just a couple hundred milliseconds, it's enough to make controlling units feel really frustrating. This is true when it comes to tasking villagers to resources, especially sheep, positioning units before a battle, and actual micromanagement within those battles. As far as I'm aware, no other Age game has input delay, and I see absolutely no reason to introduce it in AoE4. It makes the game feel slow even when you are running the game at a high frame rate and have a good connection to the other players. Relatedly, the actual movement of units and projectiles is just needlessly annoying. You have cavalry units that all seem to have a small animation in changing direction or attacking that just makes them feel unresponsive. Then you have the infamous arrow mechanics of AoE4. In case you didn't see, Age of Empires 4 essentially has thumbring and ballistics researched for you from the very start of the game, but it's actually even more than that. In this game, arrows are secretly heat-seeking missiles that can never miss their target once the attack animation begins. In addition to being frustrating to play against, it really reduces the amount of micromanagement you can use against archers, as you just can't dodge their arrows at all. It feels like Relic wants to shift unit control away from basic unit movement and positioning like in AoE2, and instead wants players to utilize specific combat mechanics like charge attacks, activated abilities, ambush forests, and so on. Now, the purpose of this video is not to pass judgment on that design choice, but rather to illustrate the small aspects of unit control that are lost when you go in that direction of game design. Before we get to number 1, we've got to do a couple honorable mentions. The first of which is the good old town center ding dong. Hey guys, did you ever click on a town center during the AoE4 stress test? Did you watch another player do it? If so, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Every time you clicked on the single most important building in every game, a loud ding dong bell sounds, and it gets really annoying really fast. However, the devs are aware of the issue, and based on a recent tweet from the official Age of Empires account, it looks like it will be fixed for launch. My second honorable mention is zoom levels. Simply put, in Age of Empires 4, you can't zoom out very far at all. This is not going to be an issue for all players, but for those with larger monitors and higher resolutions, it feels like a step back from what you're able to do in other Age of Empires games. Not the end of the world, but it's something that really should be addressed. And for number 1, we have the addition of critical features for the game. And so finally we do come to our number 1 most needed change for AoE4, and it's not even remotely close. None of the issues I've talked about so far would single-handedly torpedo the potential AoE4 competitive multiplayer scene. However, in an interview with Rock Paper Shotgun last month, I'll put the link in the description, 2 of the lead directors for the entire Age of Empires franchise, Adam Isgreen and Quinn Duffy, indicated that Age of Empires 4 will not launch with a ranked mode, a scenario editor, or even cheat codes. What? I have absolutely no idea how you can launch an Age of Empires game without a ranked mode or a scenario editor. Those things will completely tank the game's popularity on Twitch and on YouTube at minimum unless they are added to the game very soon after launch. And to be honest, I think the devs know that this is a big issue because this interview wasn't really promoted a bunch by Microsoft, at least as far as I know, and they didn't really talk about these features much in any sort of promotional material. Even with that aside, without a ranked mode, streamers and expert players are going to have very little incentive to broadcast the game. Even many regular, competitively minded players are just going to lose interest if they have to play game after game after game without fighting for those juicy internet points. This decision is especially baffling since we live in the era of esports, where a game's competitive scene is integral to its long-term success. Now, when it comes to the lack of a scenario editor, this is a huge issue on several different levels. For starters, it means no custom scenarios, something that has been a huge part of the Age of Empires franchise since the series came out. Also, it prevents random map scripters from creating custom maps for tournaments, streams, or even just for fun. I know for a fact that some of the most beloved maps for AoE2 and AoE3 came from the community itself. It's just such an important feature that is a necessity for any Age of Empires game. Lastly, cheat codes. Now, I'll be the first one to admit that this is nowhere near as important as the other two features, but still, Age of Empires cheat codes have been a beloved part of the franchise since AoE1. I mean, who doesn't love their Cobra Cars, Photon Mans, and George Crushingtons? Especially when it comes to casual players, these little cheat codes are a very memorable part of the player experience. And with that, we have my top 5 most needed changes for AoE4. I tried to focus on changes that are really necessary but don't alter the core design of the game. Please let me know in the comments what you think of my top 5 list, and if there are any sort of glaring but fixable issues that you think need to be brought to attention. Like I said, I actually do enjoy AoE4, and I very much want it to be successful. It's just currently quite rough around the edges, so to say. But that does not mean that the game is unsalvageable. If I thought it was, I wouldn't be making this video. Of course, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.